There's a risk that you talk to a lot of customers and they'll give you a lot of different directions. And so you have to have some sort of internal core thesis of what it is that you want to exist in the world, and come to the customers with that thesis and say, someone says that to me, I usually don't even read the rest of the email. I just say, yes, I would like to meet them. You will have a belief long before the investors understand this belief. And in that case, you might have to say, well, okay, the investors will not give me money, but I really, really believe in this problem in space. I'm just going to go and build it myself, get a customer or two, and prove it back. Right? Almost give you permission. I think that the thing that YC really does incredibly well is they...
Thank you so much to Dula for being the early backer of the podcast. For entrepreneurs and founders just starting out, forming a US LLC, a bank account, managing taxes, compliance can be a daunting task. If you're a non-US resident or a first-time founder who lacks the experience, knowledge to navigate the complex legal and financial landscape, it will be impossible for you to do all this. Dula is an all-in-one platform that simplifies the process of forming a US LLC, setting up a US bank account, and handling taxes, compliance for startups and businesses all over the world. Dula's mission is to democratize access to the US market and empower entrepreneurs to focus on building their businesses without getting bogged down by bureaucracy. If you're building a company, there's no better option out there than Dula.com. Hey Yuri, how are you? Hope you're doing well?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm trying to do well. Or even getting into other things. Who is Yuri? Who are you?
My name is Yuri Sagalov. I run a fund called Wayfinder Ventures. It's a seed fund. We do checks usually around $500,000 in size in B2B startups, pretty broad beyond B2B. Before I was a VC, I used to work at Y Combinator as a partner. And before that, I actually was a founder. And before that, I was a grad student that was studying electrical computer engineering, focused on distributed systems, security, very, very technical background. But that was around 14, 15 years ago now. So that's, that's kind of my professional life in a nutshell.
How good of a founder were you, according to you?
That's a good question. I think we did a lot of things right. We made a lot of mistakes, like every team does. I think that we had an amazing group of coworkers. I like the team that I worked with was probably the best people that I have ever worked with. And so if you measure a founder by the quality of the people that they hire, then I think I was very good. The quality of people was exceptional. In the early days, we had a product that a lot of enterprises really wanted, and we were very good at selling it. And I think that was also a very positive sign. And eventually we got the company acquired. So I think that was also okay. I didn't build $1 billion business, so I don't think that I am that good of a founder, but I think by a lot of metrics, I did all right.
You talked about measuring things in terms of, for you as a good recruiter, sort of. How does that metric look like for you when evaluating founders at an early stage, I'd say?
One of the criteria that I think about a lot is either storytelling or sales. You can think of it as one or the other thing. And they're actually both important for recruiting and for selling your product and for raising money. It's important for all of those things. So your ability to share your vision with customers or potential employees, it requires slightly different type of storytelling, right? Customers care about a problem to be solved. Your employees might care more about the quantity of the problem, the impact that the solution will have on a broad set of customers, not just on one customer, but also just how difficult is the problem to solve. Sometimes, particularly with engineering problems, you can attract people to you just because the problem is so audaciously difficult to solve that they're intellectually curious even more than from the customer perspective. And so I think that you're always looking for people that can articulate those things. to customers, to investors, to potential coworkers. And it is a skill that is very, very important to develop.
How? I mean, how should someone develop the skill of articulation? I'm terrible at it.
It helps when you're passionate about the problem that you're solving, right? I think that you probably are very good at explaining some things that you're incredibly passionate about to people because you just have such deep domain expertise in that area that you can explain it both in very complex terms and very simple terms. I think that it helps when you talk to a lot of people because in the beginning you might be bad at explaining it to someone. But what will happen is as you iterate, you'll talk to someone and they'll be confused. And if you ask yourself, why were they confused? You can then go back and actually try and either change the pitch a little bit to address the confusion points or clean things up, cut things out, add things in, right? And then you go and pitch that again to somebody else. And you see how they respond. And so I think that particularly for customers, it helps a lot if you're just pitching to a lot of people, because you'll just get better and better and better at it. In the beginning, everyone is bad at it. Every single person is bad at it.
First one that you've talked about, the first person who is confused, quote unquote, by your way of explaining. What if that person is the most important person that you'll ever pitch to, and you let that guy be confused about what you're building?
Well, I think people are always very afraid of that being the case. But let's imagine that it's a customer that's very important, right? Ideally, whatever product that you're building has enough customers that you could mess up 1,000 pitches, and that will still be okay. And in fact, I would worry if there's really only a handful of customers that are that important, then there's a real risk around what happens if they don't need the solution, right? Or don't experience the problem that you're having. You really want to try and find a product space where, as particularly with if you're building a product and selling to a customer, with as many customers as possible. And there's sometimes I draw people a matrix, right? If you want to build a business that will make $100 million in revenue, there's a variety of ways to do that. You could build a business with $1 million customers. And that kind of feels like doing government sales. And that's very, very difficult, right? You almost have to know the whole list of customers. You could build a business with 10,000, 100,000 customers, right? And that's much better because now you can actually make a lot of, you could make 100 mistakes and that you would still have 9,900 customers to sell to, right? Or you could build a business with $1 million, $100 customers, right? And that business feels more like a consumer business, which has its own pros and cons. The pros is that now nobody is the most important person you could ever pitch. The con is that it might be that they don't have a lot of money to spend or so. You can take that same analogy and also think about it with investors. With investors, there is a much more limited set of pool of investors that you could pitch. And yes, you probably don't want to go pitch Sequoia as your first pitch meeting, right? And so actually, usually what I recommend to founders is just if there are your absolute favorite investors, but then there's some other investors you'd be happy to work with, but maybe they're not your number 1, 2, and 3 choices, go pitch those investors first and refine your pitch, because the questions that they ask will actually probably be very similar to the questions that the other investors ask. And so there you can actually do it almost like a pyramid where you start with the investors where you'd be happy to work with, but maybe you don't care as much and you work your way backwards. But there's still so many investors, especially today, there are so many investors that it's unlikely that you'll meet the one that you really, really have to pitch.
But how do you really meet such people or such founders when they are just trying to build out? If you leave out the founder's perspective to the side now, and just about as an investor, how do you meet people who are building incredible things at the early stage?
Yeah, I think that it's, every investor has a different method of doing that. Some investors will go to universities and just try and meet as many students as they can and just before they even start. Other investors will go and search on LinkedIn for people who have just left their jobs and maybe are starting something new and like haven't quite decided what it is. For me, I spend a lot of my time on most of my deal flow is actually referral deal flow. And so it's somebody that either I've invested in or have worked with or knows me in some other way, will send the founders my way. So probably like at least over half of the deal flow that I do is referral deal flow. And then because I used to work at Y Combinator, I also still spend a lot of time on Y Combinator startups. And so that's like the other place that I spend a lot of time on. And I think for investors in particular, it's a really good place to search for companies because they are like, it's an even playing field. Everyone can go look at the same great companies. Like you can go and look at the demo day companies and I can go and look at the demo day companies. So it makes it a little bit easier to find great companies.
A lot of times that I've talked to people or people that invest in companies about the deal source that they get from Y Combinator.
Yep.
The main problem that they have is the valuation.
Yeah, I think that. Well, I think that that's a common complaint. I think that in my mind, the valuation matters to a point, but what really matters is how amazing are the companies at the end of the day. I think that like the stat that I've seen from YC is that like 5% of startups become unicorns. That's like 1 out of 20 become $1 billion company, right? It's hard to find that anywhere else in the world. Like if you showed up to YC Demo Day and just like shot darts at random, right, you should get like 1 out of 20 billion dollar companies. And so I think that it's worth paying a premium for that compared to somewhere else, right? So I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. I think that like ultimately the entry valuation matters, but the thing that matters the most is like, are they going to build $1 billion company? Are they going to build a $10 billion company? Are they going to build a $100 billion company? Like Airbnb is a $100 billion company, right? So it's just like, that's incredible. Finding that randomly on the street would be very, very difficult, right? So you would have to have some other deal source that would be equally as good.
But considering that if we keep Y Combinator companies and normal companies on a scale, what do you think takes Y Combinator companies upwards as compared to normal companies?
First thing that they do very well is they're very selective. By the time that a company becomes a Y Combinator company, it is probably already in like the top 3% of new startups in the world, right? Like it's a very, because there's such a strong selection process just to get there. But let's say you get the same quality of founder that goes through YC and the same quality of founder that doesn't go through YC. I think that the thing that YC does after that is they really change the way that founder thinks over that period of time. They spend a lot of time emphasizing just the importance of going out and talking to the customers and doing things that don't scale. And they almost give you permission. I think that like the thing that YC really does incredibly well is they give you permission for 3 months to just tell everybody else in the world to be a little bit quieter because I need to focus and I need to just like go and work on this business. And it's so hard to find time in our lives where like we can just tell the world that like, hey, these people told me I need to work really hard for the next 3 months. Please don't bother me. Right. And I think that those things combined together just like put those companies on a trajectory that's very different.
Can the founder do that without YC?
They can, and lots of founders do it without YC. And obviously, I think that like, I mean, most huge companies are not YC companies. So it happens all the time. But I think your odds are much better with YC. And it's hard to explain it. It's just kind of like, I mean, you don't have to go to a great university or a great high school to become an expert in a field, but it helps, right? And part of the reason it helps is that the peers around you at that place they all kind of lift each other together, right? And part of it is that the mentors or the teachers, the professors, like they're all like at those high schools and universities in NYC are so high quality that they lift you up, and so they just accelerate you. I think that those same founders, given enough time, would succeed without YC. But the question is like, does maybe YC shaves off a couple of years of mistakes, right? And so it gives you the opportunity to succeed a little bit faster.
In the 3-month period, how have you noticed founders changing from when they came in and when they passed out?
I think that the biggest thing that you notice with founders is that they start to dream a lot bigger. Oftentimes they come in and they have a sense of like, oh, I'm building this business. And they have like the kernel of something really interesting. But by the time they leave the program, they really have a sense of like, oh, this is how this could be a massive business. And the reason they do that is because throughout that program, there's so much emphasis on just like going out and talking to as many customers as you can rather. And the reason that changes is the moment you start talking to a lot of customers, you find out about the depths of their problems, and you find out all the different directions that your solution can go after you've solved like this little problem that you thought you were solving to solve even more problems for those customers. Right. And so it really, like, I think opens people's minds to just the possibility of like how big that business can be. They usually also end up moving a little bit faster. Nobody wants to show up to a dinner and not have a ton of progress. Right. And so they want to be able to show that like, I actually, I closed another customer and I closed another customer and we're growing 10% this week. And it's not like there isn't like homework for the YC partners. It's very much just like the group peer pressure of everybody wants to succeed and like show how much progress they're making. And so by the end of that batch, they kind of move into that new mindset of actually we should just be continually growing this way.
And when founders accelerate this fast in a 3-month period, do things lose quality or while building?
So I think that like moving quickly like that, you will build more of an MVP product than a fully polished product. But what moving quickly like that and doing these things that don't scale forces you to do is forces you to focus on like, what is the real problem you're solving for the customer? And the really interesting thing is that if you're solving a really, really, really big problem for a customer, like a hair on fire problem for a customer, the polish about the product actually matters much less. Right? You could like if the problem you're solving is so big, then they're not going to care like, is the product pretty or not? They're just going to care, is it solved? Like, is my problem solved or not? And obviously over time, you're going to move to customers where actually maybe the problem is a little bit less, hair on fire is still important for them. And they might be pickier about the experience and the polish and the quality. But I think the quality of your solution has to be very good. Like you can't compromise the quality of your solution, but the way that it looks, you should almost be a little bit embarrassed by it, right? Like if it looks super polished, you probably waited too long before shipping it. And I think that like that should actually be your mantra, like forever. You should ideally not change that over time.
How long do you think where a company from 0 to 1 or from 0 to launch, I'd say, how long do you think in the MVP stage is it before the fire that the customer's hair is on gets extinguished?
Well, I think that changes. Sometimes you have something that's, it took you a week to build because you've discovered something that they may not realize, but the problem for them is massive. Sometimes the problem takes months to solve. There isn't a right answer here. And in fact, it's interesting because how long it takes you to solve the problem is usually fully separate from how big the problem is for a customer. And so founders often make the mistake of thinking that, well, it only took me a week to solve this problem, so I really can't charge a lot of money for it because it wasn't hard for me to solve. But that's not, like, for the customer, this might be $1 million solution, right? Because they're losing money or there's an opportunity to make more money for them. And that's the leverage that you get by being a good developer, a good engineer. Like, it might not take you a lot of time to build a solution, but it's such a powerful solution and it solves such a big problem that it's worth a lot of money regardless of the time. The flip side is also true, where it's like, it might take you a year to solve the problem, but the problem is just not that important for the customer, right? And then you can't charge anything for that. And so I think the sweet spot is obviously like you want to optimize like easiest thing to build, shortest amount of time, biggest pain point for the customer.
How do founders know that whether it's the biggest pain point for the customer or the smallest pain point?
I think that sometimes it comes from the founder. Like it's always helpful if you're solving your own problem, because at the very least, you know that if nothing else, you'll be a happy customer of that problem, of that solution rather. Outside of that, it really comes down to talking to as many customers as you can. Most founders just don't talk to enough customers. And like, you don't need to build, these days you can build a mock-up, right? You don't need to build the full product. You can build a description of the product. You can have some slides. You can just walk a customer through the vision for what you think you're going to build and ask them like, how important is this solution to you? And the interesting thing is that sometimes when the solution is so important to the customer and the problem is so big, they'll actually offer to pay you before you've built anything. And if that happens, now you know you really have something. Like if they're willing to give you money just to go build this so that they can buy it from you later, that is like you've stumbled onto something really interesting.
I think which I've noticed that when talking to a lot of customers, like you said, before launching, how many customers are too many customers? I mean, because before you don't have a clear idea of where the product is going to go, and the more you talk to people, the more it mashes up inside your brain. So how do you decide upon that?
There is a risk that you talk to a lot of customers and they'll give you a lot of different directions. And so you have to have some sort of internal core thesis of what it is that you want to exist in the world, and come to the customers with that thesis and say, hey, if I built this, would you want this? Right? And they might say, actually, yes, this is amazing. This is what we want. Or they might say, actually, this problem that I have is this. And you can go and explore that problem with them. And then when you go to talk to the next customer, you can either present your original thesis or you can present what you've learned and try to hear the problem space. Ideally, you're looking for something like if you talk to 10 customers or you get 10 different problems, you need to keep either the space that you're solving in is not a big enough problem, or it may be that there isn't a core cohesive solution. And so you should probably explore something different, or it may be that you need to talk to another 20 or 30 customers. But at some point, you should be hearing the same theme. If you're not hearing the same theme after maybe 24 conversations, like if you're just hearing if you're having 20 conversations, hearing 20 themes, you probably should be thinking about a slightly different space.
If I flip that question from the customer's point of view to the investor's point of view, how many investors are too many investors to talk to?
With investors, you're looking for a different thing. You're often looking for a market of one. With customers, you need many customers to buy your product. With investors, you need one investor to really believe in your vision. And so the answer is a little bit trickier, but I will say that like if you talk to let's say you talk to 10 investors and all 10 investors give you the exact same feedback, which is you need more traction, or we want to see a bit more of a product, or something else along those lines, then you should try and sit down and think through, like, are they wrong, or do they know something, or what can I do here to prove them wrong? If I sometimes you will have a belief long before the investors understand this belief. And in that case, you might have to say, well, okay, the investors will not give me money, but I really, really believe in this problem in space. I'm just going to go and build it myself, get a customer or two, and prove it back to them. Right? So oftentimes it takes some of the most successful companies in the world had a hard time raising money, like Airbnb, Air Bed and Breakfast. When in the beginning, when they were talking to investors, nobody believed, right? So what they had to do is they had to go and actually set up, some air beds and get some people to stay and start paying. And it started compounding. And then they got accepted into YC, and YC told them to go take better photos so that the product feels even better. And that was like something that didn't scale, but they went personally and photographed all the apartments. And then customers started coming. And then once the customers started coming, the investors started believing. Right. And so I would say that, like, if you talk to 10, 20 investors and you consistently get the same feedback from the investors, it's probably a waste of time to continue having those conversations. But sometimes it takes investors a very, very long time to realize an opportunity. Investors are often wrong.
This is a great point. So if you talk about Airbnb too, from that perspective, any company that is passed on by investor, what information does the founder possess that the investor does not?
Sometimes it's driven by their own core experiences, right? So they knew that they wanted to make some extra money from their place, or that they, as students, would have totally stayed in someone's spare room to save money compared to a hotel room. But for an investor, like, if you imagine an investor, they've made a lot of money, they only stay in high-end hotels, right? They're too far away from the experience that they're solving for them to appreciate the problem. And so I think it's hard for the investors to sympathize. And they need to almost see the customers drag them there. Like, Uber had the same problem, right? Like, are you going to get into somebody else's car and they're going to drive you? I mean, you already do that with a taxi. It's not like you know who the taxi driver is, right? But the idea, and especially for investors who maybe were using black car services and haven't even used a taxi in years, they have personal drivers, it was very hard to imagine. And I think a lot of Uber's earliest investors were actually people who were much closer to the problem. That they were people that, they haven't made a ton of money yet, and they would get into a cab. And the idea of getting a cheaper cab was actually very appealing to them. And that worked for a while. Like in the angel round, I think that was probably close to true. And eventually it just becomes hard to ignore. Uber was making so much money and so many riders were using it that all the best investors could just see how sticky the product was, right? And so it's always hard to pitch an investor on an idea with like absolutely no traction, because then what you're really asking them to believe is just purely in you. And some investors are good at picking founders. Like Y Combinator is very good at picking founders, and a lot of pre-seed funds are very good at just focusing on founders. But for a lot of investors, they're going to want to see a little bit of traction.
Are you good at picking founders?
I like to think so. I don't have everyone makes mistakes here, but I think that I'm much more comfortable betting on a founder than I am actually betting on a product with traction, which is weird. And the reason is that, like, once you have traction, you have these things that distract you. Like, the conversation changes from how good is the team to how good are your metrics. But in the early days, maybe the metrics are good, but maybe the metrics are bad and they'll improve over time and you need to iterate. And so I would much rather just like spend time thinking about how great the team is.
On the same line, you invested in 3 companies that reached out to you using warm outreach or using cold outreach. What did the founders or the teams of those 3 companies have that the other in your portfolio?
There's been a handful that I've invested in through cold outreach. I need to think which ones were specifically cold outreach. There's like 1 or 2 that definitely come to mind. The biggest thing, I mean, usually the problem with cold outreach is you have maybe 10 seconds to catch someone's attention, right? And so I think that those founders had a pitch that resonated very quickly. It was just like, here's the problem that we're solving it. We're not just solving it, but we actually already have one user who's like, I think the one in particular that I'm thinking of was they didn't have a lot of users. They had like 3 users and they were hacking it together. It was super, super not scalable. But we had some users, the users love it. Here's where we started from this. And both the problem and I think they even had like a little bit about their background and why they're solving that problem in that outreach. And you have to do that almost in like a paragraph or 2, right? Sometimes I get these long memo-like emails. It's too hard to read through all of that. You really have to just like very, very quickly catch someone's attention.
When reading through these emails that you got through cold outreach, do you only does that remove the founder part of things and only the idea or the product side of things remain?
It can, because most of the time founders start from the pitch of the product and not themselves. But I think a good founder will actually still make it a little bit about the team. Like they'll say, here's our background. We're experts in this. Here's what we did before. Here's some project that we've done before that. And I actually think that, like, to me, that's much more interesting than the idea. Like if you reach a cold outreach email to me with your personal background quickly and then what you're solving, it's much more likely that I'll engage than if you just tell me what you're solving. Because I just care so much more about the team, and it's so hard to tell anything about the team from just a cold outreach. Like sometimes I can see their LinkedIn or their Twitter or something else, but oftentimes people don't even include that, right? And so now all I have is your name as an anonymous email and like the idea that you're working on, and that's just like not compelling enough. It's usually better to get a referral, just because if it's a referral, then there's much stronger signal to noise ratio, and there's almost a little bit of like a founder test. Like if you are trying to get in front of an investor, cold outreach is a high volume, low probability game, right? Where you have to, by definition, you have to spam hundreds of investors to try and get anything. Wouldn't your time be better spent trying to get in front of somebody that they know, right? Like find a mutual connection and get a warm introduction.
And you receive a warm intro, you can receive it from anyone or anyone that the founder asks to refer you to. When you receive that warm intro, what does that person tell you?
Usually, well, people will tell you different things because they value different things. I think that the thing that I look for is I think very highly of this person. Right. You could tell me you're excited about the idea. That's fine. You could tell me that you don't know anything about that idea. That's also okay. Really, like the words I'm looking for is like, I think that this is like a top 5% person, top 1% person, that I would personally invest in whatever they do next. Like if I had any money to give them, I would give them that money. That to me speaks higher than like the idea, the space, how much progress they've made, anything. Right. If someone says that to me, I usually don't even read the rest of the email. I just say, yes, I would like to meet them.
What do you think makes people think highly of other founders, or what makes them founders that are sort of like great founders, quote unquote, or likable per se?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sometimes the best founders are not very likable. I think that someone like Elon Musk, who is probably one of the most impressive founders of our generation, is very difficult to work for. And I actually think that if you talk to people that work for him, they would tell you he's maybe not very likable, but very effective and incredibly, driven, and will drive his teams to success. I think Steve Jobs was kind of like that as well, right? I don't know that people would describe Steve Jobs as likable. They would describe him as a visionary. They would describe him as an incredible executive. He had very high standards, but I don't know that his coworkers would call him likable. And that could be risky, because sometimes you'll work with someone and they are super, super nice, and so you're like, oh, they're a great person, but that doesn't mean that they're a great founder. But I also don't think you have to be mean to be a great founder. So there are many people who I think are incredibly kind. It's funny, you usually only hear about the founders who are mean. You don't really hear about the founders that are kind, like, because the mean founders are always spoken about. But I know that there are founders who are very kind and build very successful companies.
Why do you think are these visionaries the great founders that we know? I'd say because there are a lot of mean founders that exist, in my opinion, that we don't know about because they do mean.
Yes,
but
yeah,
people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk of the world, who are building something incredible and not liked a lot by certain people. Why are they like that?
So I want to emphasize, I think most founders are not mean. I think most of the time you cannot get away with being a jerk and having people work for you. The exceptions to this probably are Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. And the reason is that they are doing something so audacious, so massive, so large, that people want to work on it with them despite the fact that they're jerks, right? And can be so difficult to work for. And I don't know if Elon or Steve Jobs were a jerk, but like people will describe them as jerks. And I think part of the reason that people describe them as jerks is because their expectations are so high, right? That and when you don't meet them, they will have this outburst because in some ways they almost like know that you can do better than you just presented, and that can feel very painful. And I think that like for companies like Apple, especially under Steve Jobs and Tesla and SpaceX, you in some ways may need that type of drive because the alternative is like this thing never gets created, right? I think you need someone that's so intense and so mission driven where they put all of themselves into it, and they feel like when they see something not correct, they almost feel it like an attack on themselves to build a company like SpaceX or Tesla or Apple, right? But that's not true for every business. There are a lot of businesses that are very important, very successful, and very mission driven, where the founders are very good people. I think that one of the examples that actually immediately comes to mind is Pinterest, where Ben is just one of the nicest people. Ben Silberman is just one of the nicest people that you'll ever meet. And I don't think that, I think he's still very driven, and he is still obviously like an incredible executive, but he is also very kind. And so I think that there's many examples like that for other businesses.
Does being nice or being mean or being kind make a difference when raising money?
I think that investors sometimes almost look for someone that, like, what investors look for is someone who's formidable, someone who will not be walked over. And sometimes people mistake meanness for formidability, where like you're such a jerk and you're so tough, right? But actually, I think that you can be kind and formidable, or you can be a really nice person but still stand your ground. So I think that sometimes meanness gets mistaken for formidability, and so sometimes that might help in a fundraising cycle. But good investors are able to see past that. I think that how mean you are or how kind you are is separate from how formidable you are.
Does being formidable, does that come in front of having an ego that people have to have in order to build something with?
I don't know that. I think you can be low ego and still be very formidable and build something really great. It's not, sometimes it's not, a lot of the best founders didn't start a company because they felt like that only I can build this, right? That was not their motivation here. In many cases, they actually really wanted this to exist and tried making it exist in their previous company, right, wherever they worked. They tried building this, tried convincing the company to build this, and ended up leaving out of frustration because they just wanted it to exist. And they said, well, I can't get it to exist here. I really, really tried. And so I'm going to go out on my own, and maybe I'll fail, maybe I'll succeed, but at least I'll like try and build this. But I don't think that that's like necessarily a high ego thing. It's not a reaction of like, only I can do this. And if I don't do this, nobody will, or like nobody will get it right. It's much more like, maybe I'll fail, maybe I'll succeed, but I want to try and build this and see where we get to. And so I think that the ego portion can be completely separate from the formidability portion. Truthfully, I prefer to work with people who are low ego, like low ego in the sense of like they're not like full of themselves, right? They can be certain of themselves. They can feel like you meet them and you feel like whatever they do, they will succeed, and you want to partner with them. But it's not because they kind of give this like Superman mentality around them. It's much more about just like they're just driven. They're going to work and they're going to grind, and they're not going to be afraid of rejection, and they're just going to keep on going.
You've invested in some incredible founders. One which I respect the most, Peterson from Flexport. Flexport is a huge company. I don't know if people realize this or not, but it's an incredibly big company. And Ryan is also a great person. I mean, he said no to coming on the podcast, but that's separate.
Do a few more, and maybe he'll say yes.
Yeah, I mean, I keep seeing his tweets already, like covering it like a reporter all the time. So he has incredible.
Yeah, I think he's like bringing it. Yeah, he's clearly bringing it to. He's educating everyone in the world about what's going on. Like a lot of the things that are happening, none of us would hear about if it wasn't for him in shipping and freight. And he's making it interesting, right? Like we don't think about shipping and freight in our day-to-day lives. We order on Amazon and it arrives at our house, and you don't really think about how did it go from the factory to the Amazon warehouse to our house. And sometimes these networks are very fragile. And so I think he's done a good job of just like showcasing that.
What he's doing at Flexport, he's kind of fixing this legacy industry that has not been innovated on for centuries or decades, I'd say. In that scenario, do you think Ryan has an ego, or do people like that have an ego as to rejecting all the previous standards and putting in the modern things to play?
No, I don't think it was driven by ego for him. It's interesting. In my mind, Flexport is actually very incremental. He started a company years and years ago that was called Import Genius, and they were just helping people with import and export and digitizing some of those documents. And then while doing that, he saw that, oh my God, all of these people get charged thousands of dollars for just digitizing, for just filling out a form. So he felt that could be something that they automate. And when he did that, then he started peeling back the layers of the onion, and he kept seeing, oh, there's a problem here, or there's a problem here, or there's a problem here. And oh my God, there's so much stuff to be solved. And so that was, I think, an example of a company that was built very incrementally, not from like a founder coming in and saying, this is all broken and I'm going to fix it all and only I can fix it. It's more like every time they would talk to a customer, they would say, yes, this is a problem. And also here's this other problem. And they would talk to another customer, and that customer would say, yep, these two things are a problem. And by the way, we have this third problem. And so I think that it was very incremental in how he got to the scope of problem that he's solving with Flexport today. The initial problem was very, very small. It was very much about just like, these documents should not be handwritten. They should be digitally created.
They went from that to owning fleets of planes now.
I know, right? That's but it's the same thing with Amazon, right? Like Amazon started as selling books, and now it sells everything, and it also sells you computers and gives you, like, in the US, they own a healthcare practice and a grocery store, right? And so, but sometimes these things start from very small things. And I actually think that's really, really important. Like sometimes the biggest companies start from very, very small ideas. The ideas feel almost like a toy. And they're so easy to dismiss that it's maybe not a big market or a huge idea or something else. And like in Ryan's case, for me, it was very much about him. Like he just seems so formidable that you just wanted to see what he builds.
You talked about Amazon there and Flexport there. How much of patterns that emerge, how much of them are really real in your opinion?
Like, I think that a common pattern is starting from like a very, very small idea and just solving that idea, and then the bit like expanding from there. And Flexport is an interesting example. Amazon is an interesting example. NVIDIA is an interesting example where like they were just making chips for video games, right? And all of a sudden they're doing chips for mining and chips for mining Bitcoin and then AI. And I think that it would have been easy to dismiss NVIDIA as this company that would get eclipsed by Intel. But what they did is that like the unique thing about NVIDIA chips is that they're good at one very, very specific thing, which is matrix multiplication, like linear algebra matrix multiplication. And Intel chips are just not that good at it. And I think that Intel dismissed that as a market for a very long time because the CPU does everything, right? Like, and these chips are only good for video games. And then over time, it turned out that actually these chips are also very good for this weird thing called mining Bitcoin. And then over time, actually before that, it also turned out that actually these chips might be interesting for machine learning, where you need to do these like large matrix multiplication. But that still felt very niche, right? And now all of a sudden, it feels like matrix multiplication might be, or like NVIDIA chips might be the most important chip in the world. And the Intel chips that are super general purpose are actually not that important. So I think it's very common. Pinterest in the early days was just like people making scrapboards, and like it didn't feel like this massive business, but actually it was clear that once you start pinning things, you might actually want to start shopping for those things, right? And so now it drives a ton of shopping intent. Etsy, I think, would have been easy to dismiss. Etsy is this like you could look at Etsy and say, well, it's just like this craft business thing. Like, how many people really want to make crafts? But actually, it like created a new generation of entrepreneurs, and it's a massive, massive industry, right? I think you could have said the same thing about Twitch, live streaming video games. Like, how big is that? But actually, a video game is now as big as sports in many cases, right? And that's actually a very good example of something that felt like a toy. It's like, well, you can't be like a serious person that streams video games, but like now there's people that earn very serious livings doing that, right? And so I think that that is a very, very common pattern. The other common stuff is I think almost every startup has to do things that don't scale, especially in the early days. It's interesting to consider like the default state of a startup is dead, right? Like if you do nothing, this thing does not exist. And so you're doing everything in your power to just like, crank this thing into life so that it becomes almost like a perpetual motion machine. And so you have to do things that don't scale, because in the early days, like if you do things that scale, you just multiply them by 0 and it's nothing.
Do these patterns, is that something that founders should keep in mind? Or, I mean, there are a lot of different patterns that I think could refrain people from building something that they actually want to build. Do you think does that come into play?
I think, yeah. I mean, so I think an example of that would be for a while, delivery startups as a pattern felt like a dead end, because web then crashed and burned so heavily in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so if you tried to bring a delivery startup to an investor, they would just pattern match to this thing from 10 years ago, 12 years ago called Webvan and say, absolutely not. And if you're revisiting an idea that has been tried before and didn't work, I think that a really important question to be able to answer is like, why is now different? Right. And like, what has changed now? In the Webvan scenario, a lot of things have changed. Like there's, when Webvan existed, there were like 10 million people on the internet. Now there's billions of people on the internet. Webvan tried to start with their own warehouses, whereas like Instacart actually said, we can just go to the store directly. Webvan had to build, they had to do their own warehouses because they had to connect those warehouses to the internet because there was no mobile. Whereas now the internet is in everybody's pockets, right? And so you don't need a computer. So actually so many things have changed between then and when Instacart or DoorDash were started that you could actually have a really reasonable answer like why this time is different. But in general, I think that when you revisit an idea that has been tried many times before, it's helpful to try and think about like why is now different, and be ready for the fact that a lot of investors will just reject it out of hand because they will not think about why now is different. They will just pattern match it to the previous thing that didn't work.
When you invest in companies, how long in the history do you look, and how ahead in the future do you look for that particular company?
I usually think about the future a lot. I don't think about the past as much. Like I think about, because when I invest in a company, the investment will probably not be realized for like 10 years, right? They're going to be building it for 10 years before they become public. So I try to think about like, what will the world look like in 10 years if they succeed? I also think about what will the world look like in 2 years, because before they can get 10 years from now, they need to get 2 years from now. And so can they hit some milestones? Is there like a small set of users, like especially if they're doing something that's frontier where the market is not super obvious yet, but maybe there's a handful of users. Is that handful of users enough for them to survive the next couple of years, either get profitable or be able to raise more money? If it's something that has been tried before, I think about like, why did it not work in the past and why is this time different? Sometimes if it hasn't been tried before, it's also helpful to think about like, why hasn't this been tried before? Right. And so is there something unique that the founder discovered or some new technology unlocked that just was not possible before? And so that's like the way that I think about it from like looking back into the past. Sometimes you can actually find interesting ideas also, like where it's like, actually, this has been built before and it was successful before, but now things have changed and it makes sense to rebuild it, right? So an example of that would be a tool like Photoshop and Figma, right? Like you could look at Figma and say, actually, Photoshop exists. Yes, but Photoshop has existed for a long time and it was built for a single player use case. We're building something for a multiplayer use case. That wasn't possible 5 years ago because the internet wasn't fast enough, where you could, and our computers weren't fast enough that we could actually render things in the browser like this. But it is possible today. So like it's helpful to look a little bit back to see that. But then it's like, okay, well, if Figma succeeds, how big can it be? Well, there's tens of millions of designers, and actually maybe every company uses Figma, right? And so you can start imagining a future 10 years from now where it looks like a massive business. And so I think it's like helpful to think about the past, but really like look towards the future.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think this has been incredible. I think we'll take a hard stop there.
Okay.
One question which I like to end with usually. I've been into startups and VCs and all these things since I was like 11. What do you think is one fact that would blow 11-year-old me mind?
I think that 11-year-old you would probably be surprised with all the people that you've spoken to by now, right? I think that usually that's like, I like to think of like, if I went back in time and talked to myself and like, what would I be surprised about by myself? I think that like, and probably the same is true for you. I think that from world's perspective, I mean, 4 years ago, ChatGPT did not exist, right? So I think that if you talked to 11-year-old you and said that like you could have these conversations with a computer and they would be accurate, and you probably would have a hard time telling the difference between whether it was a computer or a human, that would be impossible to believe that would happen in the span, actually not of even 4 years, of like 2 to 3 years, right? It just like happened all at once. I think that's probably the biggest, most surprising things that would have like happened over the last 4 years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean that blew 11-year, the 15-year me mind.
Yeah, it's blowing my mind.
Yeah, definitely. I think this has been incredible. I learned a lot from this, and I've been meaning to do this for a very long time now, and I'm so glad we finally did this.
I'm glad we got a chance to do it. I think when you reached out to me, you were still 14, so I'm glad we got to do it when you're 15.
I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say?
This was a lot of fun. You asked very, very good questions. Thanks for making this happen. I'm glad we got a chance to connect, and I look forward to seeing the rest of your interviews.